Welcome to the fourth tutorial in this MultilingProfiler series, and the third tutorial focused on frequency profiling. If you haven't already watched tutorials 2 and 3, where we introduced frequency bands and word counting units, I'd recommend starting there and then coming back to this one. In tutorial 3, we saw how MultilingProfiler uses lists of the 5,000 most frequent words in French, German, and Spanish to create profiles, and how it counts words using a unit called a flemma. A flemma is all the inflected forms of a word, so all its tenses, cases, moods, and so on grouped together, regardless of how rare or complex they are. But if you're working with beginner or low intermediate learners, not all of these forms will necessarily be familiar. In this tutorial, we'll look at how to adjust a word frequency list so that it better matches the grammar knowledge that your learners actually have or are aiming to develop. To show you how this works, I'm going to use a short extract from Cendrillon, Cinderella, which is freely available on iletaiteunhistoire.com. But what I'm about to show you will also work with any kind of text, an authentic one, something graded for learners, or even one you've written yourself. I'm going to profile this extract using the 2000 word band that's roughly aligned with the CEFR A2 level. And at first glance, it looks promising. Global coverage is over 90%, which suggests that most of the words fall within the expected range for low intermediate learners. That's a good sign, as it means learners should be able to understand the gist, especially since many of the words that aren't on the list, highlighted in orange here, are words like cendrillon or pantoufle, slippers, so proper nouns or story-specific terms that can easily be glossed. But what about the grammatical forms included among these frequent words? Are all of those going to be appropriate for learners at a low intermediate level? To find out, let's use the Remove Inflected Forms dropdown. Clicking on this feature brings up a list of all the grammatical forms that are currently being counted as part of each flemma. As we saw in tutorial 3, a verb that's included in the list of the 2000 most frequent words is there because all of its forms, present, past, future, and so on, combine to make it statistically frequent in the language. The assumption behind keeping all of the forms selected and using a full flemma to create profiles is that learners can understand all of these inflections. But at A2 level, that's rarely going to be the case, and exactly what grammar students have covered varies a lot, depending on the course and the context. That's where this dropdown becomes really helpful. It gives you the flexibility to deselect any forms that you think are too advanced. From my own experience, I'd say most A2 learners of French haven't yet covered the past historic, the subjunctive, or the imperative, and depending on where they are in the course, they might not have seen the conditional or the inflectional future either. So let's go ahead and remove those forms from our word counting unit. Now you'll see a noticeable drop in coverage from 90.3% down to just 83.8%, which shows how creating profiles using full flemmas can sometimes overestimate what learners are likely to understand. By removing these unfamiliar forms, we've created what we'll call a partial flemma, a more realistic word counting unit that aligns with A2 level grammar. Now that we've adjusted the settings to create a more appropriate word counting unit, we can continue to profile the text as normal. One of the first things we'll want to do is extend the word list by adding any proper names, cognates, or key story vocabulary that we're planning to gloss in class. That usually helps boost the coverage a little bit. Even after doing that, though, we can still see quite a few orange off-list words, many of which are verbs in the past historic. This tense is common in literary French, but it's not usually familiar to learners at A2. Could students understand these forms without being taught them? Well, possibly, especially with longer and regularly inflected forms like commencer, started, which resembles the infinitive commencer. Students might be able to guess the meaning of commencer using their knowledge of the stem and their awareness of what tense is usually used in fairy tales. But other past historic forms are short, irregular, and much harder to recognize. For example, fille and fire, made from faire, pur, could from pouvoir, fut, was from être, and mis, put from mettre. These are high-frequency abstract words, and because they're so irregular, they're difficult to infer from context, which can really create obstacles for learners trying to understand the story. So, what can we do with this information? Well, there are two options for classroom applications here. First, if your goal is to teach or practice the past historic, this text could be perfect, and the tool we just used, the Inflected forms dropdown, is a really handy way to locate examples of specific tenses that you want to focus on. You can just re-enable all forms except the tense that you're interested in, so let's say the past historic, and any orange highlighted words will now mainly be examples of past historic verbs. That gives you an instant list of natural, in-context examples to work from in class. Alternatively, if your learners haven't encountered the past historic yet, you might decide to adapt the text. One option is to rewrite those past historic forms, using the perfect tense instead. In this case, it works well, because that tense also expresses completed past actions, but is much more familiar to A2 learners. You can make that kind of adaptation directly in the profiling window. But since editing text live isn't the most exciting thing to watch, I've gone ahead and prepared a version where I've already replaced all of the past historic verbs with their perfect tense equivalents. After making those changes, you'll see that the overall coverage jumps up to 95%, a much better fit for an A2 group. So that's how you can adapt your words counting unit, create partial flemmas, and make your frequency profiles better reflect the grammar knowledge of your learners. It's a really useful way to spot potential barriers in a text, highlight grammar for targeted instruction, and make small tweaks that make authentic texts more accessible. To learn more about the research behind this feature, and why explicit attention to grammatical forms is important in languages with inflection and case marking, take a look at the short summaries below, published on the OASIS database. In the next tutorial, we'll see how to further adapt a word frequency list by factoring in the learner's likely knowledge of prefixes and suffixes.